As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. Our returning guest is Mike Rivero, founder of WhatReallyHappened.com. He's a former special effects coordinator for the series Lost. He's a NASA imaging scientist. And after being blacklisted from Hollywood for making some politically inconvenient observations, Mike is now a radio host and commentator on world affairs, working out of his home base in Hawaii. Mike, welcome back to Reluctant Preppers.
Thank you for having me.
Now, on your website, What Really Happened, you really have a mission of exposing a lot of the misinformation that's propagated as truth out in mainstream sources, and that, frankly, I and almost all people have just taken hook, line, and sinker because that's all we were exposed to. And you're really specialized in sort of pulling back the facade and showing people a completely different and, in your case, a much more accurate perspective of what's actually happened out there. And on this channel, our tagline is helping you be aware and prepared, thinking that how can people be prepared unless we're aware of what's really happening. So what I'd like to do, if you're willing, is to just toss out there several statements. I could think of hundreds, but I've got a list of about a dozen here, if we can get through them, of very conventional wisdom, things that we're told and have come to expect because that's what everybody's telling us, and let you offer us a alternate perspective. And I'm not asking anybody to swallow one or the other, but just by giving them that other perspective, I'm hoping that it'll give us a lot to think about and really open people's eyes to there may be more going on there than they've been told. How does that sound to you?
Sounds great to me.
Okay, so at the sake of sounding maybe a little bit too simplistic, some of these are pretty basic, but I'd like to just give them a shot to see what your perspective is on some of these. So for the first one, our family's finances are doing great because month after month, the stock market just keeps making record highs, right?
Well, the stock market has become the favored political banner of the U.S. government to try and reassure everybody that the economy is doing just fine, and that if you have had to take a lower paying job, if you're not able to pay your bills, if you've lost your business, your home, it has to somehow be all your fault because, hey, look at the stock market, it's doing great. But the reality is the stock market is currently being propped up and inflated by an infusion of instantly created out of thin air cash coming over from the Federal Reserve. And if you are rich enough to own stocks and bonds, then yes, actually this is benefiting you. But for the vast majority of Americans who are not in these investment markets, the net result has been inflationary pressure on our food costs, our fuel costs. We're seeing the cost of everything going up. And every time the Federal Reserve cranks up that printing press or types more zeros into their computer keyboards, the money that you already have, the money that you worked for, the money that you've got in your pocket, underneath the mattress, buried by the pineapple plantation out back, loses value. It's like Lord Voldemort waves his wand, and all of a sudden your money is worth less than it was yesterday. And this is almost a hidden form of taxation on the people to keep the financial system propped up.
The next one is the economy has turned around and better times are ahead because the government's unemployment rate has dropped from double digits down to like near 5%. True or false?
Well, it's definitely false. And today, actually, the government did increase their unemployment number a little tiny bit. But there's a little bit of book cooking going on here because the unemployment number is only the recently unemployed. And they have this little trick of taking people who have been out of work for a long time and arbitrarily putting them into another category that is not included in the calculation of the unemployment rate. Now, the reality is, if you look closely at the jobs report that just came out, they're talking about creating 280,000 new jobs. The part that isn't in there is how many jobs disappeared in the exact same time period, or how many people lost high-paying jobs and were forced to replace them with lower-paying jobs. That's not included in there. They are admitting that right now there are 92, almost 93 million Americans willing and able to work who have not been able to find jobs for months or even years. But that's not included in that unemployment calculation. Now, common sense is going to tell you in a nation with a population of just under 330 million, having 93 million who are willing and able to work but unable to find jobs tells you that the real unemployment rate is about 30%. And that's up there with in fact, it's even higher than the Depression of the 1930s. But it's just more examples of the government coming up with a number that looks really good to keep the people calm and happy and not getting angry at how badly managed the nation's economy has been.
Yeah, and just to tag on to that, I know that person after person that I've met who has like a working spouse or whatever says, yeah, but they're limited to 30 hours a week at work so that the employer doesn't have to forced by the government to pay them benefits.
That's absolutely right. Even if you're on a 0-hour contract, you're only working even 2 hours a week, it's counted as a full-time job for the purposes of that jobs report.
All right, now you may have already answered part of this one, but here's one. The cost of living is getting easier on us because the price of gasoline is down to about half of what it was a couple years ago, right?
Well, obviously, the price of gasoline going down is a benefit to not only ordinary citizens, but any business that has fuel costs as part of their cost of doing business, like delivery services and so forth and so on. The drop in fuel prices, though, is an artifact of an attempt to crush oil and gas prices as an economic weapon against Russia. It kind of backfired because it did cause a lot more harm to Western countries than to Russia, because the oil companies are in financial trouble. Gas companies are in trouble. A lot of oil exploration development companies have actually gone out of business. A lot of people in the oil and gas industry have lost their jobs. So it was a mixed blessing. But offsetting that, of course, is the fact that food prices have gone up. The cost of medical care, which was already the highest in the world, has gone up even higher. The Obamacare premiums are going to go up by 50-60% as of the first of next year. So the cost of fuel, that's probably going to start heading back up real soon as well.
It's funny, too, because the cost of higher education, a lot of folks my age have students that are entering, children that are entering college or in college, and it's just absolutely decoupled for decades from the cost of increase in wages. And also, the funny thing about the cost of fuel, we all were told back when airfare prices doubled from, you used to be able to get airfare prices, round trips around $250, $300 most places. Now it's always $500 something. And the 25,000 points on your credit card that used to get you a free ticket doesn't even get you half a free ticket these days. And we always thought, well, that's because the price of fuel tripled or whatever, so you got to give them some slack. But now that the price of fuel has dropped, the prices on the airline flights have not come down.
Yeah, it's a one-way ratchet. When the price of something goes up, we've got to raise our rates and our fares. But if the price goes down, it's just absolutely invisible. And we're in a stage right now where everybody's very nervous. They're trying to maximize profits and hang on to that cash ahead of downturns that are in the future. And there's a lot of gouging going on. I mean, certainly out here in Hawaii, where airfare is the only way to get anywhere in the world, even to the other islands, because the inter-island ferry was driven out of business. The airlines have the attitude of we can charge whatever we want and the people will pay for it. And that kind of thinking is only going to get you so far, because we're reaching the point where Americans simply don't have the money to pay for either airfare, improvements to their home, education. They don't want to borrow anymore. And I'm hearing from a lot of sources how, especially in the second quarter of this year, revenue streams are drying up, customer numbers are dropping, people are just reluctant to spend the money. They don't want to borrow the money. And we're already seeing major iconic retailers are shuttering their doors. The system really is beginning to lock up for a very simple fundamental reason. For an economy to operate continuously, Yes, there are always going to be the people at the top sucking wealth out of the top of this giant pyramid structure. But there has to be a mechanism where that money gets recycled back down to the lower levels so that workers can trade their labor and skills for new wealth to pump back into the system to keep it going. Unfortunately, as our government has become more fascistic and aligned with these Wall Street money junkies, they're all obsessed about taking wealth out of the top, and nobody is managing the economy in such a way that we can bring new wealth in at the bottom. And that's why it's starting to lock up. Consumer spending has just crashed since the 2008 meltdown of the mortgage-backed security fraud. And prior to 2008, consumer spending was 60% of the nation's economy. That is just going away. You cannot support an entire economy on the spending of the super rich. There aren't enough hours in the day for them to spend that much money. And even they are starting to slow their purchasing habits.
So for people who are nearing they're watching some of this stuff unfold, but they're thinking, well, after all, I'm getting near the end of my career, and they're thinking, I don't need to be overly concerned about my retirement income because I've been paying into Social Security all my life, and the government's been saving it up, and I get a letter from them each year showing me just how much the government will pay me once I retire, so I'll be fine, right?
Well, it's a nice illusion, but the reality is that back during the Clinton administration, remember how we had that magic federal government surplus, and he was out there saying, it's the economy, stupid. I'm really clever. We had a federal government surplus. And how he got it was going into the Social Security Trust Fund and grabbing the cash surplus that had been built up for the baby boomer retirements. And he basically borrowed that money, swapping it for treasury bonds, and he spent it as general revenues. In other words, Clinton's federal government budget surplus was acquired by embezzling the retirement money of American workers. And the U.S. government cannot redeem those treasury bonds in the Social Security Trust Fund. That's why they're talking about the retirement age is being raised to 70. Benefits are going to have to be cut. And Social Security really isn't going to be there. I mean, they're going to be running out of funds here in about another 2 to 3 years. And it is a problem. And the U.S. government, even worse, they're getting ready to loot savings accounts, 401ks, IRAs, all to keep this Ponzi scheme central bank going a little bit longer. Last year, Congress passed a law. Most Americans don't know about this. It redefined savings account holders as unsecured investors in the bank, meaning that if the bank your savings account is in gets into trouble, the bank can dip into those savings accounts to try and deal with the situation, like they did in Cyprus. They're getting ready to do it in Europe. In fact, the European Union has ordered all of Europe's banks to within the next 2 months to have rules in place to basically acquire the wealth of their depositors to deal with any coming shortfalls. Here in the United States of America, along with redefining savings account holders as unsecured investors in the bank, they reordered the priority of payouts. In the event a bank goes first, it used to be the bank's customers, the depositors, were first in the line to have their money returned by whatever bailout was going to happen. Now we're at the bottom of the list, and derivatives exposure is the new top of the list. And the derivatives exposure is so huge in the American financial system, there won't be anything left over for anybody below that, whether it's the bank's employees, the bank's depositors, other investors. It's just really being rigged to allow the government to plunder what's left of our wealth to try and prop our little Ponzi scheme banking system up a little while longer. And in the long run, it cannot possibly work because there is a structural fault in the private central bank model in that it is designed to produce more debt than money with which to pay that debt, and the debt will grow and grow and grow until it crashes the system. And that's exactly what's going on right now. The moment that private central bank is given control of the currency and it issues that first pretty printed piece of paper, more money is owed to that bank than actually exists, and there is no way to reverse that situation. And the debt builds up until the public doesn't want to borrow anymore because they're dealing with the accumulated debt. And it's at that point the Keynesian economists come in and say, well, government has to borrow on behalf of the people, and I might add, without their permission, to keep the system going a little bit longer. You then reach a point where the public can't borrow anymore, or rather the public won't borrow anymore. The government can't borrow anymore. The U.S. government is at or has perhaps already exceeded its lawful debt ceiling. And it's at that point the money junkies start saying, well, wouldn't a war be really good? We can go out and conquer this other country and just take their wealth to make good on all of this accumulated debt. And that's why there is a direct link between private central banks and world wars. In fact, before the creation of the Federal Reserve, there was no such thing as a world war. Now we're on the doorstep of big mistake number 3, and it's all being driven by money junkie banker games. Right now, the reason that they're trying to get into a state of conflict or war with Russia and China is to stop the ruble and the yuan from further displacing the U.S. dollar in global trade and banking. Because the U.S. financial system makes a profit on the fact everybody's using the U.S. dollar to buy and sell oil or buy and sell weapons or anything else on the globe. And they become dependent on that. They've allowed our manufacturing to decline both in quantity and quality. We've destroyed our own agricultural exports with this disastrous experiment with GMOs. And so right now, the entire American economy is dependent on maintaining the hegemony of the U.S. dollar in global trade and banking. And that's why the U.S. is willing to risk war with Russia and China to destroy the BRICS, to destroy the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, to destroy the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank, all of these alternative systems that are being set up by other nations so they can get away from the U.S. dollar and private central banking. These are the real targets of all these wars.
Now, you may have already touched on most of this one, but there's still a finer point that people would say, okay, so everything you say being what it is, I still don't need to go off the deep end preparing for some collapse, because if I hear on the news that things are going badly, I can always withdraw my money from the bank and brokerage accounts if I want to, right?
Well, by the time you hear things are going downhill on the corporate media, it will already be way too late. The common sense advice that we are putting out at our website and our radio show is you should have no more money in the bank today than you need to cover your immediate obligations. You should have the rest at home under your own control. Part of it is currency. Part of it is physical silver and gold. If your money is in the banking system's computers, you've already lost control of it. And I look at what happened to the former Soviet Union as a most likely model of what is about to happen here in the United States of America. The government had lost the trust of its people. It was broke, bankrupt, in debt. The Soviet government collapsed of its own rot and corruption. There was not a lot of bloodshed involved, thankfully. And there was about a 4-month period where the Russian people had to be taking care of themselves and each other while the new Russian republics were formed. And the good news is, of course, that life under the new Russian republics was tremendously improved over what it was under the old Soviet leadership. And I see the same thing happening here in the United States of America. Our private central bank-based economy is destroying itself. The U.S. government has destroyed its own credibility, and it may easily come apart before they can manage to start a new world war for real. And the American people are going to have to get through 4 months of being able to provide for themselves and their families and taking care of each other in their communities, because there won't be any government or agency to do it, while we put together a whole new United States, primarily based, I would hope, on the existing Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And we'll start a whole new republic, and things will be a lot better. And rule number 1 for the new country is no more private central banking, because private central banks do not exist to serve the nation and its people. They exist to serve themselves. They make themselves rich by stripping off the wealth of the nation and its people and acquiring assets. It is ruled by compound interest, and it's no more legitimate a form of governance than rule by divine right or rule by slavery. And like those earlier failed systems, it only works as long as people allow themselves to be brainwashed into believing this is the way life is supposed to be. And it isn't. The United States started without a private central bank. We fought a war to break free of a private central bank, the Bank of England. And the early United States blossomed, and it was prosperous, and immediately the private central bankers tried to get back in. They set up the first Bank of the United States. It plundered the people. Congress refused to renew the charter. The bankers started the War of 1812 to force us back into private central banking, and it actually worked. The debt-stricken U.S. had to authorize the second Bank of the United States. Andrew Jackson shut that down. They tried to assassinate him. And it's just been this constant war between people who want to be free and those who want to enslave everybody with this banker-created debt system. And a little over 100 years ago, They succeeded in setting up the third bank of the United States, only they didn't call it that. They called it the Federal Reserve to fool people into thinking that it was part of the government. But it isn't. The Federal Reserve is no more federal than Federal Express. And like those earlier banks, it's not about taking care of the nation and its people and what is best for the economy. It's about looting and plundering the wealth of the nation to put in the pockets of the Federal Reserve's owners. And like every other nation enslaved to a private central bank, we are hovering on the edge of collapse right now. And they're urging war against anybody else who's got tangible assets to conquer and bring in to try and make the bottom line on that ledger in black ink rather than red.
Yeah, but talking about military might, I mean, people will say, well, my savings in dollars is backed up by the full faith and credit of the United States, which is in turn backed up by the strongest military in the world. So the dollar's health is assured for the foreseeable future, right? Foreseeable future.